Hello, and welcome to another episode of Sound Strategic. Recent tensions between Greece and Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean have once again raised questions about the strength of the NATO alliance. But beyond this current crisis, the transatlantic relationship between the US and its European allies that has long been the linchpin of the alliance has shown signs of serious strain in recent years. President Trump's frequent complaints about European defense spending reflects a change in how Washington views the NATO alliance. And as domestic politics have changed and security challenges have multiplied, the US is increasingly seeing China and not Europe as its priority. What this new strategic focus means for NATO and how it will impact the US military posture globally is the topic of today's episode. And to help me address these issues, I'm very happy to welcome to the podcast EJ Herold and Henry Boyd. EJ is the new director of the IISS Americas office in Washington, D.C., and prior to joining the IISS, he served 6.5 years as Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment at NATO. He graduated from West Point and had a full career in the U.S. Army as an artillery officer and foreign area officer for Europe, and has spent 21 years living in Brussels, Paris, and Germany. Henry is a IISS veteran and my fellow China watcher on all things defense at the Institute. He is the research fellow in the Defense and Military Analysis Program here at the IISS and contributes to the annual Military Balance publication each year, providing detailed analysis of military capabilities for various countries around the world, with a particular expertise on the US, Russia, and China. It's great to have you both on the podcast, so thank you for taking the time to speak with me today.
Well, thank you, Meia. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Meia. Great to be back. Like we done with the place.
I'd like to start with a few current challenges within the alliance that have made headlines in the past few months, and what these might tell us about changing U.S. ties to NATO and Europe under Obama and Trump. So first, of course, is the ongoing dispute between Greece and Turkey. The dispute between these two countries over maritime delineation isn't new, but what do the U.S. and NATO responses to the latest developments tell us about how each of these actors is dealing with a potential conflict between two allies?
Okay, well, let me jump in on that. This discussion is not new. It predates NATO. It predates a lot of the politics that we are currently living through today, and highlights an ongoing situation with Greece and Turkey that is problematic, and yet something that has been well maintained or well handled throughout their challenging history. We just had a great webinar run by Emil Hakayem, who's another one of our IISS fellows, looking at this question about tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the experts that he had on discussed this from a variety of different points of view: economic, military, geopolitical, historical. And it all boils down to a discussion of equity and rights that are enshrined in or mired in history, bad feelings, mistreatment in the past, and a desire to see justice and equity achieved. The relationship of NATO to this situation has been, as it always is, very balanced and mitigated. On the military side, you have the chairman of the military committee, Sir Stuart Peach, bringing the military officials together to try to establish a sort of tactical understanding of movements and intentions so that it de-escalates the situation. And on the political level, the Secretary General, who operates as everything at NATO through consensus, has to tread a very fine line between the politics of two member nations of the alliance who have distinct and defined opinions that he cannot necessarily reconcile. So he's calling on their good offices to work together to achieve an understanding and an agreement on the tensions that exist.
I think that's a very apt summary of the situation. The thing that I found interesting watching this from outside, I would not classify myself as either a Greco-Greece or a Turkey specialist or an Eastern Mediterranean specialist for that matter. But I'm interested in both of your views. Maybe in previous years, this might have been seen as higher up NATO's agenda of issues to be addressed. It's interesting to me, but this comes on the background of a series of other high-profile issues that NATO have had to face in recent years, and whether or not, dating back to, I guess, even like the most recent sort of flashpoint being the July announcement by Secretary of Defense Mark Esper and EUCOM Commander Todd Walters about pending troop withdrawals from Germany, bringing kind of the US-Germany relationship back into sort of focus in a big way, and whether or not that an alliance having to juggle its continuing commitments in Afghanistan, its continuing training mission in Iraq, the COVID-19 crisis, sort of a challenging relationship between its key member, the United States, and its European allies, is now also having to deal with what is a long-standing Greek-Turkish issue, revived and sort of emphasized by resource developments in the Eastern Mediterranean, but dealing with that at the same time poses a kind of multispectral challenge that the alliance is relatively new to, I think.
Well, Henry, I think that's an apt point that you raise about the U.S. engagement in the alliance and in Europe. As we look at the question of changing threat perceptions or where the interests of the United States may lie, it's interesting to me that the allies have not paid attention significantly to the consistent message from Washington over the last decade. Famously, then Secretary of Defense Gates came to Brussels on his sort of valedictory tour to say farewell before giving up his position as Secretary of Defense, and he made a very shocking or troubling speech in Brussels, in which he pointed out quite frankly and quite explicitly that the allies needed to do more to share the burden of the alliance with the United States. Now, this was not a new message. This is a message that has been consistently delivered by the United States since the founding of the alliance, practically, that the allies needed to continue to step up. Through the Cold War, the United States bore an outsized share of the burden because it was in the United States' interest. With the evolution of perceptions of threats and challenges in the global environment, the United States, which has a finite resource in its defensive structures, is looking at how they can get more bang for the buck and how they can stand up to competition in the Pacific while mitigating challenges in Europe. And one of the ways that they believe that that can be best handled is if the European allies are the first line of resistance or the first responders, backed up by U.S. security guarantees, the nuclear umbrella, and the promise, as has existed throughout the Cold War, of returning in force should that be required to the European continent. This has been a message that followed through the George W. Bush administration into the Obama administration and has now been much more starkly pronounced in the Trump administration, perhaps less eloquently or elegantly by a president who likes to tweet his opinions and his displeasure. But nonetheless, the diplomacy behind all of that has been fairly consistent across different administrations of different political persuasions, that there needs to be a greater sharing of the burden between America and its allies.
So let me just jump in and return back to the question of the announcement of the withdrawal of troops from Germany. Should we then understand this to be a response by the Trump administration to pressure or at least punish perhaps European and NATO allies for not carrying their weight? Or is it actually, does it in fact have more to do with U.S. rebalancing of its commitments?
Honestly, the Twitter storm seems to have been a poorly timed and perhaps unfortunate occurrence, because the reality as expressed within the defense community here in Washington in particular is that the necessary rebalancing of forces and the increased requirement for agility and the concern over static forces or forces stationed in camps, posts, and stations around Europe as being vulnerable to sudden attack, hypersonic weapons, the potential new way of fighting of a resurgent Russia means that our forces need to be able to be rapidly deployed, moved about at will, and less tied to fixed locations or static infrastructure than they currently are. In addition, by moving to new locations closer to the peripheries of the alliance, whether it be to the east or to the south, making them more deployable or redeployable by land, sea, or air, makes good strategic sense. And the repatriation of some units back to the United States so that they can be rapidly projected in whichever direction is necessary, again, is consistent with the strategic outlook expressed in the National Defense Strategy and the National Security Strategy.
I think that's a fair point to make, really. It's one of those things that struck me in the reaction to, both Trump's tweet and Esper Walters' announcement, is how Europe-focused a lot of the commentary was. It was as if this move was simply about the only thing that mattered to the US must be Europe. So all that comes down to is whether or not the US cares about Europe. The Pentagon is watching a global picture and is as if you read through, if you either listen to the speech itself or read the transcript of his comments, you get a fairly clear indication that yes, Trump accelerated the announcements and the decision making over EUCOM, but that the EUCOM posture review is part of a wider review of US global commitments. There is an Indo-PACOM review coming. If you go back to when Jim Mattis was Secretary of Defense, you could see CENTCOM's posture under review and assets being moved out of theater as the US tried to rebalance its global commitments to allow it to effectively undertake what I think the National Defense Strategy terms dynamic force employment, as opposed to the more kind of consistent presence operation that had characterized their overseas commitments in previous years. One of EJ's a point about connecting the Trump administration's line on burden sharing to that of previous administrations, I think, is a very valid one. I think a lot of this may sound quite familiar if you go back and look at the kind of things General Raymond Odierno said about EUCOM rebalancing when he was head of the army and was responsible for the last time the US withdrew heavy commitments from Europe, when the last two heavy armed brigades were stood down in Germany in 2013-2014. And Leon Panetta as Secretary of Defense under Obama and the Asia pivot, that there's a lot of policy documentation under the Obama era about stepping back from the US's traditional Europe first look, becoming more Asia focused, and the necessary posture alignment that changes there. Yes, there's local politics involved. US politicians are usually keener to see more stuff stationed at home. It brings with it jobs and investments in local communities in the US. The kind of citizens who appreciate stuff deployed abroad don't get to vote in US elections. But I think there is a genuine, long-standing strategic logic at play here, and I think being driven by the Pentagon more by the White House. Yeah, and to sort of follow Henry's point there, two things have happened in recent months that reinforce that. First, Secretary Esper spoke through the IISS in a speech that would have been given had we held the Shangri-La dialogue this year to the Asia-Pacific region, and expressed the plans of the United States for the deployment of forces, the political and military support to the region, the reinforcement of bilateral relations, as well as multilateral groupings that the United States participates in. In addition, there was an announcement recently that the Secretary of Defense has directed the education system within the United States military to focus 50% of its attention on
China as a strategic competitor. Now, that's significant because there has not been, since the end of the Cold War, that sort of emphasis on any particular nation as a competitor. Certainly, we never forgot or never lost sight of Russia as a potential adversary or strategic competitor. But quite frankly, their military capacity declined so much since the end of the Cold War until recent times that there was less credibility that they were going to be the flashpoint. The Chinese have increased their capacity both on land, sea, and air to an extent that they are now quite logically the primary strategic competitor of the United States and the one that the U.S. is focused on. So given the policy speech in July, given the subsequent comment by the Secretary of Defense to the education system just recently, this is a clear indication that the United States views the risks to the Russian or to the European environment of Russian aggression have not gone away, but they are certainly much reduced by comparison.
Yeah, I was really struck by the Esper speech. It's been a relatively open secret dealing with the U.S. Department of Defense and its associated advance, but the Esper was specific as saying, principal to many of our efforts is to focus the department on China. That explicit level of concentration, I think, is worth bearing in mind.
I mean, let's talk about the China challenge then. As you said, the U.S. No longer minces its words over who it views as the primary challenger to the United States' military power in the Indo-Pacific region. And of course, certain NATO allies also share this concern. The European Union, on its part, and certain EU member states, of course, view China as a new systemic rival to the US and Western liberal democracy. But I wonder, do NATO and US threat perceptions still align here? Although the EU, of course, has said that China is a systemic rival, and NATO has shared some concerns over the fact that China is coming to NATO. There is, of course, the question of whether interests are perfectly aligned or will have to be bridged somehow.
So that's a good question, and all the evidence that you need is to look at the work plan of the alliance today. They have initiated over the last year directed studies and directed work throughout the committee structure that is focused on responding to the challenge of China as a strategic competitor. Now, is the alliance going to entertain war plans for the South Pacific and fighting China? No. But the alliance is facing an increasingly intrusive China in the Mediterranean basin, in the Middle East and North Africa, throughout Africa, and the activities of the Chinese on a commercial and a military diplomatic level are affecting the issues that have direct impact on the alliance: migration flows, illicit traffic, the question of sovereignty and foreign ownership. So the port of Piraeus and the fact that the Chinese practically own the port because they came in with investment money that now has a significant impact on potentially closing that port to alliance operations should the decision be taken. All of these are concerns that are motivating the work of the committees to consider what NATO's options are, what responses are appropriate, and the preparations or the preventive actions that should be taken to prepare the alliance for confrontation with an aggressive China, whatever form that takes, whether it be economic, political, or other.
I think it's certainly been fascinating to watch the rise up the agenda of China, both within NATO but also within the national agendas of NATO member countries in Europe. The unkind commentary has been kind of connect that to a kind of a desire to placate President Trump and the United States by being seen to do something. But I think there is more to it than that. I think there is a genuine realization that although for NATO, Russia, certainly post-Crimea, poses a serious challenge, NATO can't afford to be simply fixated upon that one threat. And that the Chinese involvement in Europe in a variety of spheres, be it military, be it diplomatic, be it economic, their intelligence activities are going to increase rather than decrease in the near future, and that these things will have a direct impact on NATO, i.e. that the effect of Chinese military modernization and military challenge into the United States is not simply going to be an indirect withdrawal of US attention and resourcing from Europe. It's also going to pose European countries and NATO as an alliance with direct challenges. Again, as EJ said, not necessarily in terms of a kind of a war scenario in the South Pacific, but in terms of other areas such as technology, where Chinese actions raise questions about European policymaking and raise questions about the balance between economic investment and security concerns in certain European capitals.
Several years ago, I was on a personal trip to Malta for vacation, and it was the first port visit of People's Liberation Army Navy ships in the Mediterranean that had ever taken place. They were making their way, they had made their way from China all the way through the Red Sea into the Mediterranean, and I think went up further up the European coast before turning around and making their way back, simply demonstrating the capacity to move ships and to coordinate port visits, refurbishment, replenishment, and to do it successfully with, being able to keep the ships operational. That's a big deal for naval forces. And not every Navy is capable of navigating around the globe. The fact that they have demonstrated this capacity and continue to demonstrate that capacity was a wake-up call to the NATO Alliance. They have always considered the Mediterranean to be a NATO lake, if you will. And there's a 3 Cs initiative at NATO to look at actions in the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea, and how they coordinate coverage, responsibilities, and delineate military objectives in those areas is very important. The fact that you see a new actor in those waters really focused attention, certainly among the NATO militaries, but also led to the activity that's happening at political level through all these committees.
I just think it's interesting when looking back to some of the justification when the US discussed about moving troops around in Europe and rebalancing posture there, the importance of presence in new members so we still call them new member states, relatively speaking for NATO, new member states in Romania and Bulgaria, and if the Mediterranean is not entirely open to you, then obviously that suddenly poses a serious question mark about your policy in those countries. And it's something that I think, that the traditionally NATO have rightly been able to see the Mediterranean as a relatively kind of clear area that can be used for strategic purpose. The increasing presence of the Russians there is one challenge, but the Chinese there as well, I think, really highlights to NATO that great power competition is more than just rhetoric. There are practical things that are now coming out of that.
I suppose it's not just the Russians or the Chinese on their own as well, right? If I'm not mistaken, Russia and China held joint live fire drills in the Baltic a number of years ago. So I suppose it's also that combined challenge of an increasingly closer, if not an alliance type of relationship between Russia, at least one that serves the purpose of a useful purpose between the two at the moment, that NATO is cognizant of. I do wonder, though, how this might all change and how the relationship between the US and NATO might change, considering the U.S.'s upcoming November 3rd presidential elections?
Well, I think fears of U.S. withdrawal from the alliance are somewhat overblown. Yes, the president has enormous power, but he is also subject to the checks and balances of our Constitution, and the voice of Congress is quite unified on this, both Republican and Democrat, that the value of the North Atlantic Alliance cannot be underestimated, and it can't. If it didn't exist, we would have to invent it. Is often heard in the halls of Congress. So I think that while the president makes some very heavy-handed complaints against the alliance from a transactional point of view, I think that the political interests of the United States remain quite focused on having a strong NATO alliance. Certainly, the burden sharing issue will remain an important issue, but NATO is going to be a force to be reckoned with, no matter who wins after this election.
I think it's fair to point out the US demand on NATO has been for greater burden sharing, not for a kind of abandonment entirely. That whatever Trump's reaction to, again, the transactional approach, the level of what he sees under investment by the Europeans, for the US's global posture, it's important to get the Europeans to be able to contribute more. But doing that requires staying engaged in some capacity. Certainly there isn't a US move on either side of the aisle to depart Europe entirely, to write Europe off as strategically unimportant. The challenge is balancing Europe against commitments elsewhere. And I think the idea that either side of the US political complexion is going to contemplate that kind of radical change, I think is not on the cards at the moment. I'd agree with EJ. I think when you've got things like no NATO withdrawal acts being discussed and put around, then I think Congress's will is fairly clear on this point.
Well, and don't forget the importance of demographics. I am a typical American in the sense that I'm a European by origin, a combination of German, Irish, English, French, Scottish, and that's just me. There are millions of people like me in the United States who represent the diaspora from Europe that has settled and grown the United States over 2 centuries, and they have a voice in Congress with very powerful lobbies who advocate for the European continent. Now, it's true that the mix of nationalities changes over time, and that we have a strong Asian population, a strong Latin American population, a strong African population. And for issues in any of those regions that matter, they also can call upon large lobbies who have interest in those regions. So I don't want to overplay the European angle, but my point is that Europe will remain central to the United States from an economic point of view, our largest trading partner, from a military strategic point of view, control of the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the protection of lines of communication. From a diplomatic point of view, giving weight to the U.S. opinion in various fora, whether it be the UN, or other global bodies, and we're going to continue to see the strong interest of the Europeans to have tight relations with the United States. And one of the ways that you maintain that is through the NATO alliance.
But what strikes me is kind of the nature of how that importance plays out in terms of resourcing balance, and from both sides of the aisle, from a Trump second term or a potential Biden administration, is that's going to have to continue, but without the kind of the central devotion of resources and time and attention. I think it's clear, not just on a defense side, but across government, that the US's foreign policy is going to have to devote increasing amounts of attention to what happens in Asia, and that Europe will not be in a position, unless something horrifically unexpected happens, to command the same level of central attention it may have done in the past.
Well, by the same token, I think that Europe focused on Europe is important. And realistically, Europe is not going to be facing up to the challenges that China is creating in Southeast Asia and in the Indo-Pacific region, where the U.S. arguably and has demonstrably said we have interests. We are an Atlantic power, but we're also a Pacific power. And so it's natural for the United States to focus on one of those two regions where they find the greater need for attention. If you consider the relationship with Europe and the alliance structure of NATO in particular, it's an opportunity for the United States to say, we're still part of NATO, but we count on you, the European nations, to carry the burden there while we focus our attention for your benefit in the Indo-Pacific region.
Now, I wish I didn't still have to ask about the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, but unfortunately, looking at the recent trends here in the UK and elsewhere in the world, I do. And I was wondering whether both of you might end on a question about resourcing. How might the COVID-19 pandemic affect and subsequent global economic shocks affect both the US's ability to rebalance its security commitments and how NATO might consider rising to the China challenge?
Well, this is a significant question today. And in fact, if you had asked me this question 2 months from now, when we'd completed the series of 3 webinars that we have planned on COVID and its impact, I'd probably have a better answer for you. But the answer that I can give you today is, look, we suspect, based on current information, that there will be a shrinkage of not just U.S. GDP, but all the NATO allies' GDPs as well. And that shrinkage is going to affect a lot of things, including defense budgets, we believe. So paradoxically and unfortunately, it may also occur that because GDP shrinks, some allies achieve the 2% goal of GDP for defense spending by actually spending less than has been requested. You'll recall that in 2014, the allies committed to the Defense Investment Pledge at the Wales Summit, which was to spend 2% of GDP on defense and 20% of whatever was spent on defense on recapitalization, R&D, or new equipment. And that's one of President Trump's major criticisms, is that allies haven't achieved that. Well, the goal was to do it by 2024. Okay, that may be too slow, but that was what was agreed. And allies are making progress toward that. The Secretary General lauds the fact that already there has been significant spending increases by a number of allies, and that if all the allies hit the 2% objective, that it would represent something like $100 billion a year additional spent on defense to the benefit of the NATO alliance. That said, COVID is definitely going to have an impact on that, and the issue is, can we continue to see the allies achieve the goals and objectives they've set for themselves through NATO summit declarations, given that GDP is quite obviously going to shrink, and will they be able to maintain their defense commitments? The jury is out on that, and we'll only see that over time. I suspect that defense, being one of the primary obligations of democratic governments, that we will see an effort to maintain defense spending, to retain a certain level of capacity and capability. But the plans for modernization, new weapon systems, new capabilities will likely be extended and delayed because of these budget contractions.
Yeah, I think I would agree with most of that there. I think defense planning in general is often kind of a science that delivers in a much longer time frame than initial planners hoped. I think even before COVID-19 was a word anyone recognized, or a phrase, a name, I think there were open questions about the viability of resourcing plans for a lot of NATO, European, US, Canadian defense modernization programs. I think, frankly, that's also true for other countries like Russia and China themselves. People had raised questions about sustainability of the spending plans required to underpin these things, and the level to which domestic concerns and domestic issues required resourcing and attention that these plans hadn't taken into account. I think it's fairly obvious, it's a bit of a no-brainer, that COVID is going to deeply exacerbate that issue for most countries. I think from an alliance perspective, one of the issues I think we haven't touched on yet is the potential for greater interoperability challenges. So not just the overall level of spending, but what happens if the US maintains a higher level of modernization, pushes faster into new technologies and new capabilities in a way that leaves some of its European and other allies behind, and what that means for the US's ability to then operate with them, for the other allies to play a useful part in the way US war planners conceive of operations. So US armies has a 2035 goal for its ability to achieve multi-domain operations under, I think the plan is now aim point. Is the wonderful compound name of that for the process. But assuming that continues roughly on schedule, it's got a fairly ambitious plan for delivering through joint effect a kind of a sophisticated sort of reconnaissance fires campaign. Now, in a European context, the US is prepared to deliver that. The first MDTF task force brigade headquarters style is expected to be active from 2021, I think, under planning, maybe slightly later now. But if the greater burden is expected from European allies to provide resourcing around that, to complement that, and to provide the additional capabilities to bring that at scale, will the Europeans still be able to achieve that? Even the larger European players, the British, the French, the Germans, be able to bring a level of capability and sophistication in the same time frame to complement that, or are we risking a kind of divergence of capability gap where the US desire for greater burden sharing is complicated by what kind of burden they want the allies to share, and what kind of burden the allies are willing to fund?
Well, I share the concern, Henry. But what I would point to as an example historically of how that sort of a scenario did not play out, as the U.S. was talking about network-centric warfare, NATO adopted network-enabled capabilities as their buzzword. It led to the creation of Allied Command Transformation, the repurposing of the Allied Command in Norfolk. And I would suspect that similarly, as the United States pursues new capabilities, that they'll be able to, that the allies will find ways to keep pace, albeit at a less expensive capability development.
Well, I think that's an excellent point to end on, and a really good platform for our next episode, I'm sure, in the future altogether. I want to thank you both for coming on the podcast today, and it's been a really interesting discussion.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure to be with you today, Meia.
And to our listeners, we hope that you enjoyed today's episode as well. So don't forget to follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, and to recommend it to your friends, of course. And for all of the latest IISS analysis on global defense and security issues, please visit our website and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. See you all next time.